NASA first logged the anomaly as debris. That was the official explanation. A dense object, drifting between the outer layers of Saturn's rings, caught in a pattern of movement that looked strange, but still natural enough to ignore. At that distance, almost anything could be dismissed as noise. A sensor error, a fragment of ice, a trick of shadow and scale. But the object kept changing direction. Not randomly, repeatedly. The movement was subtle at first, small adjustments, tiny shifts against the motion of the surrounding ring particles, the kind of thing a tired analyst might miss at the end of a long shift. But over several days, the pattern became impossible to explain. Everything else in Saturn's rings moved with the current, pulled by gravity into slow, elegant streams of frozen dust and stone. This thing moved against it. The signal came from the Cassini archive first. Old data, buried telemetry from a section of ring scans that had never been fully reviewed. Someone noticed a repeated distortion in the same region, years apart, always in nearly the same place. At first it looked like a flaw in the equipment, but the distortion was too clean, too centered, as if something inside the rings had been interrupting the scans on purpose. NASA reopened the file. A deep space observation team was assigned to compare the archived readings with new telescope data. They expected to rule it out in a day. Instead, they found the object again within hours. Same region, same impossible movement, same interference pattern, spreading through the feed every time the sensors focused directly on it. They increased magnification. At first, all they saw was darkness. Saturn's rings were bright from a distance, but up close they were chaos, endless sheets of ice, rock, and dust orbiting in silence. The object hid in that chaos like it belonged there. A shadow among shadows. But once the software isolated its shape, the room went quiet. It was too smooth. Nothing in the rings should have looked like that. Every natural object around it was jagged, uneven, broken apart by time and collision. This thing had edges, curves, surfaces that reflected light in controlled bands. It looked less like a rock and more like a structure. Then it moved again. Not drifting, not tumbling, turning. The analysts watched the playback 3 times before anyone spoke. The object had rotated by a few degrees, slowly enough to miss in real time, but clearly enough to confirm later. It had orientation, deliberate orientation. It was choosing how to face the instruments pointed at it. That was when the audio anomalies began. The visual feed was already unstable, but now narrow-band interference started bleeding into the communication channels, a low mechanical rhythm, then layered tones. Not speech exactly, not music either. Just a sequence of sounds repeating in perfect intervals, each cycle slightly altered from the one before it. The team assumed it was contamination from the equipment, but the pattern changed every time they changed the angle of observation. When they narrowed the scan, the tones accelerated. When they pulled back, the tones slowed. When they shifted to thermal imaging, the signal stopped entirely. And when they returned to visual, it came back louder than before. By then, the object was no longer the only problem. The ring material around it had started to change. thousands of tiny particles near the anomaly began drifting out of their natural paths, gathering in thin lines around the object's outer shape. At first, the arrangement looked accidental, then it formed concentric arcs, then radial lines, then a geometry so precise that one analyst described it as a machine assembling itself out of ice. The formation expanded for 17 minutes. No one in the control room said a word during that time. They just watched the particles move into place around the hidden structure, building a shape too large to fully capture in a single frame. The object at the center had never been small. It had only been buried. What emerged from the rings was enormous. It was not a ship. Not in any way humans would design one. There were no engines, no visible seams, no recognizable symmetry. The surface looked carved rather than manufactured, smooth in some places and ridged in others, like a fossil made from black glass. And across that surface, dim lines of light began to pulse in response to the incoming scan. It had known it was being watched. The team tried to shut down the feed. That was the official claim later anyway, that the scan had become unstable and the system was powered down as a precaution. But the internal report said something else. The shutdown command was sent, but never completed. The interface stopped responding. The cursor froze. The signal tone flooded the room speakers at full volume, drowning out every voice, until one by one the monitors in the lab went black. All except one. The final screen showed a close-up of the anomaly. Not the entire structure, just part of it. A curved section emerging from the ring shadow, covered in drifting ice. For 6 seconds, nothing happened. Then a circular section on its surface opened. Not fast, not violently. Slowly, like an eye adjusting to light after a very long time in darkness. Inside was no reflection, no lens, no machinery anyone could identify, just a depthless field of black, so complete it seemed to absorb the image around it. One analyst later said, looking at it felt wrong, like staring through a hole cut into reality itself. Then the object turned fully toward the camera. The transmission ended there. No explanation was ever released. The archived data was sealed, reassigned, or erased, depending on which version of the story you believe. Publicly, the anomaly does not exist. Unofficially, the region of Saturn's rings where it was found is still flagged in certain observation databases, with a restriction code no civilian team can access. And every few months, according to one former contractor, a signal still comes from that same section of the rings. Same frequency, same interval, waiting for something to answer.